you realize a positive net present value? Will you realize a positive internal rate of return? So again, this is kind of stuff where it all really kind of comes together, to be real blunt about it. Okay, now what we're going to do is look at regulation of international business. There's just a little bit here that I want to cover, but this is the stuff that kind of shows you some advantages and some limitations. Believe me, there's no way to create, go through all of the law that creates opportunities and limitations, but I'm just going to give you a kind of a little bit of a taste of it. Okay, so let's talk about export rules first, all right? And you see a little note, that a special note on the U.S. Constitution. Now, if you remember when we were going through constitutional law, we mentioned that this is a very economic document, all right? Political, yeah, I mean, it's creating government, but it was a very economic government. And the first thing I want you to know is that our Constitution prohibits tariffs on exports. Okay? Now, our founding fathers were way ahead of their time, all right? They realized that the American government should never be set up where producers here should be forced to pay a tax when they're sending something out to another country, right? That makes those goods more expensive, all right? Okay, now, let's just look at a couple limitations and a couple of opportunities, and we're going to start with the Export Administration Act of 1979. Now, what it does is it regulates the export of strategic technology to other countries, right? And generally what you need is you need a license in case there's a close call, all right? It's kind of funny, and depending upon your age, you may remember this little stuffed thing called Furby. Now, Furby was this thing that looked like a cross between an owl, a house cat, and a rat. It was just the bizarre thing. But if you remember Furby, it was kind of like the Elmo thing where everybody had to have it during a holiday season. I can't remember what year. I think it was about 20 years ago. Well, it was under suspicion as to whether it could pass the Export Administration Act of 1979 because it had an algorithm whereby you could talk to Furby and Furby would talk back. And there was some concerns that was such a strategic technology that if an enemy of the United States got a hold of it, they could deconstruct Furby, and it might be threatening to our national security. Now, it eventually got through, okay? But let's get back to reality to a certain degree and talk about what often pops up here. It's almost always software. Okay, the Export Administration Act covers, things like Furby, all right? But it's almost always software, and it's software in some particular good, or it's the software itself. Again, if it's a close call, the National Security Administration will take a look at it and decide whether you're allowed to send it overseas. Okay, a couple of opportunities here. The Revenue Act of 1971, which is kind of a blah name, but what the Revenue Act of 1971 did is it gave tax breaks. We won't get into what the tax breaks were. It gave tax breaks to American firms that make goods here but send them elsewhere. Okay? Now, the design of the Revenue Act of 1971 was really to keep American manufacturers here in the United States by giving them tax breaks to do it. Now, if this were an international business law class or an international trade class, we'd get into some of the nitty-gritty, because not all of the Revenue Act of 1971 is really kosher with current world trade law. But what I would say is that for the most part, it's still good, so we'll treat it as good in this particular class. But the Revenue Act of 1971, there's a delicate balance. The United States government can't use those tax breaks to actually subsidize firms. And again, well, for the most part in this class, treated as okay. However, the Revenue Act of 1971 didn't just apply to American-based firms. It gave tax breaks to any firm, say even a French firm or Norwegian firm, that actually makes goods here in the United States. So it doesn't necessarily mean you have to be an American firm. You have to be an American-based firm. Now I'm saying, what's the difference? Well, a Norwegian firm basically has a Norwegian charter, right? A Norwegian Articles of Corporation. Okay, now the Export Trading Act of 1982, similar theory, all right? It gives tax breaks to lenders of American-based exporters. So under the Revenue Act of 1971, right, the American-based exporting firm gets tax breaks, but under the 1982 statute, lenders who lend money to those exporters also get a break. So if you put it, a tax break. So if you put those two things together, that's a powerful 1-2 punch. Again, however, current world trade law does not allow for governments, even through their tax breaks, to illegally subsidize exporters. So again, if we had more time, we'd look at the situations where it wasn't quite applicable, but in this class we'll treat it as good. Okay, now let's go ahead and look at the Export-Import Bank. All right, now this is something important. I always like to spend some time on it. The Export-Import Bank kind of gets a black eye every now and again. It seems like every 5 years Congress wants to kick it around and literally kick it around and say it's not worthwhile. There is a little bit of an argument that I'm open to, but let's go ahead and go through it. The Export-Import Bank is really a crown corporation. It's a corporation wholly owned by the United States government, and its job is to serve as the lender of last resort for American-based exporters and importers. All right? It's a lender of last resort. So let's say you've got what might otherwise be a risky project, right? Where you're making goods that you want to export, but there's some risk there. Or you want to import. It might be risky. Okay? The Export-Import Bank will make sure that you've engaged in due diligence to find a domestic traditional lender, Chase Bank or Bank of America, whatever, all right? But you failed. Or you failed in part. Okay? So what the Export-Import Bank will do is if they think the project's worthwhile and you've tried traditional forms of finance, they will be the lender of last resort. So the idea is you've tried other things, you just can't get it to work. And by the way, you know, that includes a mix of domestic as well as international lending, so maybe there's a foreign bank that might lend you the resources you need to engage in the export and import transaction. Now the other thing, all right, so let's say, for instance, Chase Bank will do 50%, right? Well, the Ex-Im Bank, as it's nicknamed, might do the other 50%. So it doesn't have to be the sole lender. In fact, it would prefer not to be the sole lender, right? It might just pick up the balance, all right? It may just pick up the balance. Okay, now, those are the rules associated with exports, and again, it's just kind of a hodgepodge, but just wanted you to see a limitation. I wanted you to see some opportunities. Our law is full of both, for sure. Okay, let's look at import rules. Okay, now, that means the goods are coming here, right? They're coming into the United States or coming into any country. Now, the one thing I want you to keep in mind is that unless there is a trade agreement in place, most likely a treaty, but unless there is a trade agreement in place, all right, countries are free to do this as they wish, all right? And again, unless the trade agreement is in place, they can have tariffs, quotas, prohibitions, whatever. They are free to do that. Okay, so let's look at the three basic types of limitations, all right? The first is a prohibition, all right? And it's just what it sounds like. Countries can say, you know what, those goods aren't coming in, all right? We're not allowing those goods into our country, okay? And I'm going to give you a short list of what you're generally going to find, okay? All right, number one, anything that is deemed to be obscene. Could be pornography, child pornography, it doesn't matter, but anything that's dubbed obscene by that particular country. Now, sure, different countries have different ideas as to what's obscene. If you remember from our discussion way back when we're talking about constitutional law, there's a very small set of what would be considered legally obscene in this country. So a prohibition based on obscenity Not much to it. Child pornography, of course, is always something you can't bring in this country, but the manufacture, distribution of that's illegal domestically anyway. Okay, 2, weapons. You're always going to find prohibitions on weapons. Now again, different countries have different ideas as to what types of weapons should be prohibited, but they are free to do so. Okay, next, certain food items, right? Food items can be prohibited. A lot of it's based on consumer safety, as you can imagine. Genetically modified foods are often on those kinds of lists. I, for the most part, really don't find problems with GMOs, but nonetheless, some countries do. All right, next, animals. There are some animals you simply cannot bring in, right? The concern, of course, is the food chain or the ecosystem, but there are limitations on animals, all right? And lastly, plants, all right? For the same reasons, right? We don't want our own ecosystem ruined. You know, I used to travel to Canada a lot more than I do now, and I'd always bring, you know, back my mom some seed. My mom's a real green thumb, and she likes to plant flowers and stuff, and I'd bring back some seeds. That became a much bigger concern after 9/11. It was tough to sneak things through, so I just quit doing it. Kind of gives you an idea, right? Okay, so prohibitions. Countries are free to do that as they wish, okay? Quotas are different. You can bring it in, but only so many, right? You can bring it in, but only so many. Okay, so you're not likely in this day and age to find much in the way of quotas. All right? If I were teaching this class 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, you'd find much more in the way of quotas in our law. We're tied to so many free trade agreements, you just don't find that. And free trade agreements by nature are designed to really remove quotas. Okay, now if there is a quota system in place, it basically says only 10,000 can come in. Maybe only 15,000, maybe 100,000. What you're doing is you're protecting the American-based market for that particular good. Could be cars, only 15,000 cars maybe from another country, all right? Because you want to try to protect the American manufacturers, right? The American car manufacturers. Now, what we've seen is that over time that quotas really have not worked well to do that, all right? Okay, now, with that said, if there is a quota in place and you want to bring that good in, you do need an import license. Now, actually, you need an import license for a lot of things, but they become much more dear here, right? Much more expensive because there's a limited supply of something coming in. But you will have to bid for an import license. All right, and then lastly, tariffs. All right. Now, tariffs are really nothing more than taxes applied to a good coming in from another country. All right. It's generally assessed in one of two ways: either a percentage of the good, the cost of the good, so maybe 10% on a $50 good coming in. Then all of a sudden, look out, it's $55, right? But it could also be a flat fee. So whether the good is 25 bucks coming in or 75 bucks, you're just going to tack on $2. Okay. Again, without a trade agreement in place, countries can, for the most part, attach whatever tariff or quota or prohibition that they want. Okay, now, in this day and age, you don't see much in the way of tariffs. You see them in some places. You see them on some agricultural products. That's probably the one area we don't need to get too far into the weeds, but if you wanted one sector of the economy, it would probably be agriculture, where you'll still see some tariffs. But again, free trade agreements are designed to do away with those things as well. Okay, now, can you find in some sectors goods that are attached to both tariffs, or that I should say have a tariff and a quota attached to them? Yes, that's possible, but again, very, very rare in this day and age. Okay, now the last thing I want to look at is the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917. Now you look at the year and you can pretty much have an idea as to why the statute was enacted. It was largely to address some of the concerns we had with World War I. But the law is still good, and what it does is it prohibits any Imports, by the way, it doesn't address exports, any imports coming from countries that are designated as enemies of the United States. Now, by the way, that enemies list is really, really short in this day and age, okay? But nonetheless, there is a list, and it does address certain goods. And North Korea, of course, would be your classic example, I think, in this day and age, in the year 2017, right? So imports coming from countries designated as enemies of the United States are prohibited. Now, does that list change? Absolutely, the list does change. Okay, so again, there are some examples of some import rules. Okay, so when we come back, we will look at economic integration.